The frozen lake stretched before Marlowe Anders like a sheet of cracked glass under the pale winter sun, and she should have known better than to trust its deceptive surface. But grief had a way of making a person reckless. The year was 1884, and winter had come early to Desdemona, Texas, bringing with it an unusual cold snap that had frozen the livestock ponds and sent the townsfolk scrambling for extra firewood. Marlowe stood at the edge of the lake on the outskirts of town, her heavy wool coat doing little to keep out the biting wind that swept across the frozen expanse. She had come here to think, to escape the suffocating sympathy of the townspeople who still whispered about her father's death 3 months prior. He had been the town doctor, respected and loved, and his sudden passing from fever had left Marlowe alone in the world at 22 years old. She took a step onto the ice, testing it with her boot. It held firm, and she ventured further, drawn by the stark beauty of the frozen landscape. The lake was small, perhaps 200 yards across, fed by a spring that usually kept it from freezing solid even in the coldest winters. But this year was different. This year, the cold had come down from the north with a vengeance that no one in their generation had seen before. Marlowe walked carefully toward the center, her breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. She did not hear the warning crack beneath her feet until it was too late. The ice gave way with a sound like a gunshot, and suddenly, Marlowe was plunging into water so cold it felt like 1,000 knives piercing her skin. She gasped, inhaling water, and immediately began to struggle. The current from the spring pulled at her heavy skirts, dragging her down and away from the hole through which she had fallen. She fought her way back to the surface, breaking through only to find herself already several feet from where she had gone in. The ice above her head was thick enough to block her exit, but thin enough to see the pale light of day through its cloudy surface. Panic seized her as she pounded against the frozen barrier, her lungs burning for air. Oliver Quinn had been riding fence line on the western edge of the property his family had purchased 6 months ago when he saw the woman walk out onto the lake. He was 25 years old, tall and lean from hard work, with dark hair that he kept short under his wide-brimmed hat. He had been a cowboy for 7 years, working ranches from Kansas to New Mexico before his family decided to settle in Texas and try their hand at cattle ranching. Oliver had paused to rest his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Copper, when movement at the lake caught his eye. He watched with growing alarm as the figure in dark clothing ventured further onto the ice. When he saw her fall through, Oliver did not hesitate. He spurred Copper forward, riding hard toward the lake. He could see where she had gone in, the dark hole in the ice like a wound in the white surface. But as he reached the shore and dismounted, running onto the ice with more courage than sense, he realized with horror that there was no sign of her at the hole. The current must have pulled her under the ice. Oliver dropped to his hands and knees, crawling across the frozen surface as quickly as he dared, his eyes scanning desperately for any sign of movement beneath the cloudy ice. His heart pounded in his chest, and he prayed harder than he had in years. There. A dark shape maybe 20 feet from the hole, moving weakly. He could see pale hands pressing against the underside of the ice. Without thinking, Oliver pulled off his heavy coat and drew the axe he always carried on his belt for clearing brush. He brought it down hard on the ice, again and again, the sound echoing across the empty landscape. The ice was thick, perhaps 6 inches, and each blow sent shocks up his arms. He could see her face now through the ice, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. Her movements were growing weaker. Oliver struck the ice with everything he had, pouring 7 years of cowboy strength into each blow. A crack appeared, then another. The ice began to give way in chunks. He used the back of the axe to pry up large pieces, tossing them aside. The hole was barely large enough, but it would have to do. Oliver plunged his arms into the water, so cold it felt like his skin was being burned off, and caught hold of the woman's coat. He pulled with all his strength, dragging her up through the hole. She was not breathing. Her lips were blue, her skin pale as death. Oliver hauled her out onto the ice, then carefully dragged her toward the shore, knowing the ice would not support them both if he moved too quickly. Every second felt like an eternity. When they reached solid ground, he laid her on the frozen grass and turned her onto her side, pressing hard on her back. Water poured from her mouth, and then she was coughing, gasping, drawing in great shuddering breaths of air. Oliver pulled off his flannel shirt, leaving only his undershirt, and wrapped it around her shoulders. She was shaking violently, her teeth chattering so hard he feared she might crack them. He knew he had to get her warm and fast. Hypothermia would kill her as surely as drowning if he did not act quickly. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice urgent. She nodded weakly, and he helped her to her feet. She could barely walk, her legs refusing to cooperate, so Oliver did the only thing he could think of. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to where Copper waited patiently. He managed to get her into the saddle, then swung up behind her, wrapping his arms around her to hold her in place and share what warmth he had. He grabbed his coat from where he had dropped it and draped it over both of them as best he could. "Where do you live?" he asked, but she could not answer through her shivering. Oliver made a quick decision and turned Copper toward his family's ranch. It was closer than town, and she needed warmth immediately. He urged the horse into a careful canter, not too fast for fear of unseating his passenger, but fast enough to get them to shelter quickly. The Quinn ranch was modest, a main house built of timber with a stone chimney, a barn, and several outbuildings. Oliver's father, Thomas, and his younger brother, Isaac, were working in the barn when Oliver rode up shouting for help. Thomas came running, his weathered face creasing with concern when he saw the soaking wet woman Oliver carried. "She fell through the ice at the lake," Oliver explained quickly as his father helped him get her down from the horse. "She was under it. We need to get her warm." Thomas nodded and took charge with the calm efficiency of a man who had lived through many emergencies. "Isaac, get your mother. Tell her to prepare a hot bath and find dry clothes. Oliver, bring her inside to the fire." Oliver carried Marlowe into the house, where a fire already burned in the large stone fireplace. His mother, Catherine, appeared within moments, her practical nature taking over. She was a sturdy woman with kind eyes and graying brown hair pulled back in a bun. "The poor dear," Catherine said, immediately beginning to strip off Marlowe's wet outer layers. "Oliver, you did well bringing her here. Now out with you while I get her into dry things. You need to change yourself before you catch your death." Oliver retreated to his room, his hands shaking now from the cold and the aftermath of fear. He had not realized how terrified he had been, seeing that woman's face through the ice, watching the life draining from her. He changed quickly into dry clothes and returned to the main room to find his mother had Marlowe wrapped in blankets near the fire, trying to get her to drink hot tea. Marlowe's eyes met his over the rim of the cup, and for the first time, he truly saw her. Even pale and shaking, even with her dark hair hanging in wet tangles around her face, she was beautiful. But it was her eyes that caught him, gray-blue like storm clouds, filled with gratitude and something else he could not quite name. "Thank you," she managed to whisper, her voice hoarse from the water she had inhaled. "You saved my life." Oliver found himself unable to look away. "Anyone would have done the same," he said, though they both knew that was not true. If he had not been there, if he had not seen her fall, she would be dead beneath that ice. I am Marlowe Anders, she continued, still shivering despite the fire and blankets. Dr. Anders' daughter. Recognition flashed across Catherine's face. Oh, you poor child, we heard about your father. Such a tragedy. He treated my Isaac when he had the lung fever 2 years ago. Saved his life, no question. Over the next hour, as Marlowe slowly warmed and regained her strength, the story came out. She told them about her grief, about the loneliness of the big house in town where she had grown up, about how she had walked to the lake without thinking, seeking solace in the stark winter landscape. She did not mention that part of her had not cared if the ice held or not, but Oliver saw it in her eyes. He recognized the look of someone who had lost their way. Catherine insisted Marlowe stay the night, refusing to hear any arguments about propriety or imposition. You cannot possibly ride back to town tonight after such an ordeal, she said firmly. You will stay here, sleep by the fire, and in the morning Oliver will take you home if you are well enough. Marlowe was too exhausted to protest. She fell asleep in the chair by the fire, wrapped in borrowed blankets, her hair finally dry and falling in dark waves around her shoulders. Oliver found himself watching her as the evening wore on, unable to concentrate on the book he was pretending to read. There was something about her that had gotten under his skin, some combination of her beauty and her sadness and her strength. She had fought hard under that ice. She had not given up, even when it seemed hopeless. When everyone else had gone to bed, Oliver remained in the main room, feeding the fire and keeping watch. He told himself it was to make sure the fire did not go out, that Marlowe stayed warm and safe, but the truth was he simply could not bring himself to leave her alone. Around midnight she stirred and woke, her eyes finding him immediately in the firelight. You are still here, she said softly. Someone needed to watch the fire, Oliver replied, but they both knew that was only partly true. Marlowe sat up slowly, keeping the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Why did you risk your life for me? She asked. You did not know me. You could have fallen through the ice yourself. Oliver was quiet for a long moment, considering. I do not know, he finally admitted. I saw you out there, and when you fell, I just moved. I did not think about it. Most people would have thought about it, Marlowe said. Most people would have gone for help or hesitated just long enough for it to be too late. I am not most people, Oliver said with a slight smile. My mother says I have always been too impulsive for my own good. Despite everything, Marlowe found herself smiling back. Then I am grateful for your impulsiveness. They talked through much of the night, the conversation flowing easily despite their recent acquaintance. Oliver told her about his years as a cowboy, about the vast open ranges and the hard but honest work. He spoke of cattle drives and desert storms, of nights under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Marlowe found herself drawn in by his stories, by the obvious love he had for the land, and the life he had chosen. In turn, she told him about her father, about growing up in the house of the town doctor, learning to help him with his patients. She had a natural gift for healing, her father had said, and he had been teaching her everything he knew. His death had left her not only alone but without purpose. Women were not accepted as doctors, no matter how much knowledge they possessed. That seems wasteful, Oliver observed. If you have the skill and the calling, why should it matter that you are a woman? Marlowe looked at him with surprise. Few men held such progressive views, particularly out here on the frontier. Most people do not see it that way, she said softly. Most people are fools, Oliver replied bluntly, and Marlowe laughed, a real laugh that felt strange after months of grief. As dawn broke over the Texas landscape, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Catherine emerged from her bedroom to find Oliver and Marlowe still talking by the fire. She gave her son a knowing look, but said nothing, merely setting about making breakfast. Thomas and Isaac joined them, and the meal was filled with easy conversation and laughter. Marlowe could not remember the last time she had felt so comfortable, so welcomed. But eventually, she knew she had to return to town. People would be worried, and she had responsibilities. Oliver saddled Copper and helped Marlowe up onto the horse, then swung up behind her as he had the previous day. This time, though, there was no emergency, and Marlowe found herself very aware of his arms around her, of his warmth at her back. The ride to Desdemona took nearly an hour. The town was small but growing, with a main street lined with businesses and houses spreading out in all directions. Marlowe's house was on the eastern edge, a two-story structure with a sign that still read Dr. Anders hanging beside the door. Oliver helped her down from the horse and walked her to the door. "Thank you again," Marlowe said, suddenly feeling shy. "For everything. You saved my life, and your family showed me such kindness." "You are welcome," Oliver replied. He hesitated, as if wanting to say something more, then simply tipped his hat. "Take care of yourself, Miss Anders." Marlowe watched him ride away, an unexpected loneliness settling over her. She went inside to find her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, waiting anxiously. The older woman had noticed Marlowe's absence and had been on the verge of organizing a search party. Marlowe explained what had happened, carefully omitting the part where she had not really been paying attention to where she was walking on the ice. Mrs. Patterson insisted on staying with her for the day, fussing over her like a mother hen, and Marlowe allowed it, touched by the concern. But as the day wore on, Marlowe found her thoughts returning again and again to Oliver Quinn. She remembered his face through the ice, the determination in his eyes as he chopped through to reach her. She remembered the sound of his voice in the night, deep and steady, telling her stories that made her forget her grief for a few precious hours. She told herself she was simply grateful, that what she felt was nothing more than the natural response to being saved, but her heart knew differently. 3 days passed before Oliver returned to town. He told himself he had legitimate business, supplies to purchase, fence wire to collect from the general store. But the truth was he could not stop thinking about Marlowe Anders. He found himself riding past her house, then feeling foolish and turning away. Finally, he worked up the courage to knock on her door. Marlowe answered, and her face lit up with genuine pleasure when she saw him. "Mr. Quinn," she said warmly, "please come in." Oliver stepped inside, removing his hat. The house was neat and comfortable, filled with books and medical equipment. "I wanted to see how you were doing," he said. "Make sure you had fully recovered." "I am well," Marlowe assured him. "Thanks to you." She gestured to the sitting room. "Would you like some coffee? I was just about to make some." They sat together, talking as easily as they had that night by the fire. Oliver found himself telling her things he had never told anyone, about his dreams of having his own ranch someday, about the freedom he had felt riding the open range, but also the loneliness of it. Marlowe spoke of her desire to continue her father's work, of her frustration at the limitations placed on her because of her gender. "You could still help people," Oliver suggested. "Maybe not officially as a doctor, but people need medical care. They would come to you if they knew you had your father's knowledge." Marlowe considered this. "Perhaps," she said thoughtfully, "though I would need to be careful. Some people would not approve." "Some people will never approve of anything," Oliver said with a grin. But that has never stopped progress. From that day forward, Oliver found reasons to come to town several times a week. Sometimes he brought Marlowe gifts from the ranch, fresh eggs or butter his mother had sent. Sometimes he simply came to talk. Marlowe found herself looking forward to his visits with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened her. She had never felt this way about anyone before. The townspeople began to notice, of course. In a small town like Desdemona, nothing stayed secret for long. There were whispers and knowing looks, but most people seemed pleased. Oliver Quinn was known to be a good, hard-working man, and Marlowe Anders was well-liked despite her unconventional knowledge. They made a handsome couple, people said, and it was about time Marlowe had someone to look after her. Winter began to loosen its grip on Texas, and the ice on the lake melted away, leaving no trace of the near tragedy that had occurred there. Spring came early, painting the landscape in wildflowers and new grass. Oliver asked Marlowe to go riding with him one warm afternoon in March, and she agreed eagerly. They rode out beyond the town, into the rolling hills dotted with mesquite and live oak trees. Oliver showed her the land his family was working, the cattle bearing the Quinn brand grazing peacefully. He spoke of his plans for the future, of expanding the herd and building a better house. And as he talked, Marlowe realized he was describing a future he wanted to share with her. They stopped beside a creek, letting the horses drink, and stood together in the warm sunlight. Oliver took Marlowe's hand, his calloused fingers gentle as they intertwined with hers. "I know we have not known each other long," he said, his voice serious. "Only a few months. But from the moment I saw you through that ice, fighting to survive, something in me changed. I cannot explain it, Marlowe. I have never felt this way about anyone." Marlowe's heart raced. "I feel the same," she admitted softly. "You saved my life, Oliver, but you did more than that. You gave me a reason to want to live again. After my father died, I was so lost. I did not care what happened to me. But now, everything is different." Oliver cupped her face in his hands, his dark eyes searching hers. "I love you, Marlowe Anders," he said simply. "I know I am just a cowboy without much to offer, but I love you with everything I have. Would you consider, maybe someday, being my wife?" Tears spilled down Marlowe's cheeks, but they were tears of joy. "You are not just a cowboy," she said fiercely. "You are brave and kind and good. You see me for who I truly am, not just what society says I should be. And yes, Oliver Quinn, I would be honored to be your wife. Not someday. Soon." Oliver kissed her then, gentle at first and then with growing passion, and Marlowe felt something inside her that had been frozen since her father's death finally thawed completely. She was alive, truly alive, and she was in love. They were married 6 weeks later, in late April, when the wildflowers were at their peak. The ceremony took place in the small church in Desdemona, with most of the town in attendance. Catherine cried happy tears, and Thomas clapped his son on the back with pride. Marlowe wore a dress of cream-colored lace that had belonged to her mother, and Oliver wore his best suit, looking uncomfortable but handsome. When they exchanged vows, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives, there was not a dry eye in the church. The Quinns helped Oliver build a house on the ranch property, a wedding gift of land from Thomas. It was smaller than the main house, but perfect for a young couple just starting out. Marlowe moved her father's medical books and equipment, and with Oliver's encouragement, she let it be known that she would provide medical care to anyone who needed it. Some of the older, more conservative townspeople disapproved, but when their children fell ill or their wives needed help with a difficult birth, they came to Marlowe's door all the same. Oliver worked the ranch with his father and brother, building their herd and reputation. He was good with cattle, patient and skilled, and the ranch prospered under the combined efforts of the Quinn men. But no matter how long his day had been, no matter how tired he was, Oliver always made time for Marlowe. They would sit together on the porch of their little house in the evenings, watching the sun set over the Texas hills, talking about their days and their dreams. Life was not always easy. There were droughts and harsh winters, cattle diseases, and market downturns. There were neighbors who never quite accepted Marlowe's role as an unofficial doctor, who whispered that it was not proper for a woman to be doing such work. But Oliver stood by her always, defending her right to use her gifts, and gradually even the most stubborn critics were won over by the lives she saved and the suffering she eased. Marlowe treated everything from broken bones to fever, from difficult childbirths to injuries from farm accidents. She could not officially call herself a doctor, but everyone knew that was what she was. Oliver built her a separate room attached to their house where she could see patients and store her medicines, and he often assisted her, learning as much as he could so he could help when needed. In the winter of 1885, a year after they had met, Marlowe realized she was pregnant. She told Oliver one evening as they sat by their fire, the very fire he had insisted on building into their home because he remembered how cold she had been when he pulled her from the lake. Oliver's face went through a dozen emotions in as many seconds: shock, joy, fear, pride, ending finally on pure happiness. He pulled Marlowe into his arms and held her close, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "I am sure," Marlowe confirmed, laughing at his expression. "I am a doctor's daughter and something of a doctor myself. Remember, I know the signs." "A baby," Oliver said wonderingly. "Our baby." Then a thought struck him. "You will be careful, will not you? No more riding out to distant farms alone, no more heavy lifting." Marlowe rolled her eyes affectionately. "I am pregnant, not made of glass. But yes, I will be careful, I promise." True to her word, Marlowe scaled back some of her more strenuous activities as her pregnancy progressed. But she continued to see patients, right up until the day her labor began in late summer of 1886. Catherine Quinn came to assist, as did Mrs. Patterson from town, and between them and Oliver's anxious pacing, Marlowe was well looked after. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Oliver refused to leave, holding Marlowe's hand through the worst of it, murmuring encouragement and love. When their son finally arrived, red-faced and wailing, Oliver wept openly. They named him Thomas Jasper Quinn, after Oliver's father and Marlowe's father, whose middle name had been Jasper. Fatherhood changed Oliver, though Marlowe would have said he was already as devoted a husband as any woman could want. He was besotted with his son, spending every spare moment holding him, talking to him, singing old cowboy songs in his rough voice that somehow always soothed the baby. Thomas grew strong and healthy, a happy child with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray-blue eyes. The years passed in a blur of work and love and life. The ranch continued to grow, and the Quinn family's reputation as honest, hard-working people spread throughout the region. Marlowe's medical practice flourished as well, and she trained several younger women in basic medical care, passing on the knowledge her father had given her. It was not official schooling, but it was better than nothing, and it meant more women in the area had access to medical knowledge. In 1888, Marlowe gave birth to a daughter they named Grace Catherine, after the Grace they felt their lives embodied in Oliver's mother. 2 years later, another son arrived, Samuel Oliver, called Sam by everyone. Their little house grew crowded, so Oliver and his brother expanded it, adding rooms and a larger porch. The main Quinn ranch house was always full of family, with Thomas and Catherine doting on their grandchildren and Isaac, who had married a local girl named Emma, contributing children of his own to the chaos. On a winter evening in 1890, 6 years after Oliver had pulled Marlowe from beneath the ice, they stood together on their porch watching their children play in the yard. Thomas was 4 and already showing signs of becoming a skilled horseman like his father. Grace was 2, stubborn and fearless. Sam was just learning to walk, taking tottering steps between his siblings. "You ever think about that day?" Marlowe asked softly, leaning against Oliver's solid warmth. "The day at the lake." Oliver wrapped his arm around her. "I think about it all the time," he admitted. "I think about what might have happened if I had not been there, if I had not seen you. I think about how close I came to losing you before I ever really had you." "I think about it too," Marlowe said. "Sometimes I have nightmares about the cold, about the ice above me. But then I wake up and you are there, and I remember that everything that came after was worth it. My father used to say that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best ones. I did not understand what he meant until I met you." Oliver turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders. "You gave my life meaning, Marlowe. Before you, I was just drifting, working one ranch after another with no real purpose. But you made me want to build something, to create a life worth living." "We created it together," Marlowe corrected gently. She reached up to touch his face, this man who had risked everything to save her, who had loved her completely and without reservation. "I was drowning long before I fell through that ice, Oliver. I was drowning in grief and loneliness. But you pulled me out of that too. You saved me in every way a person can be saved." They kissed as the sun set behind them, their children's laughter ringing in the air, and Marlowe thought about the strange and winding path that had led her here. If someone had told her that day at the lake, in her darkest moment, that she would end up so happy, she would not have believed them. But life had a way of surprising you, of offering second chances when you least expected them. The years continued to unfold, bringing the usual mixture of joy and sorrow that marked any life. Thomas Quinn Sr. passed away in 1892, dying peacefully in his sleep at the age of 68. The family mourned him deeply, but they also celebrated a life well lived. Catherine moved into a smaller house in town, insisting that Oliver and Marlowe needed the main ranch house now that their family had grown so large. Oliver took over full management of the ranch, running it with the same integrity and skill his father had shown. The Quinn brand became one of the most respected in the region. Marlowe continued her medical work, and as the years passed, attitudes slowly began to change. By the mid-1890s, there were actually a handful of female doctors in larger cities, though it was still rare, especially in rural areas. But Marlowe had proven herself so many times over that even the most skeptical had to admit she was as skilled as any formally trained physician. Their children grew up surrounded by love and the wide open spaces of Texas. Thomas Jr. proved to have his father's affinity for ranch work and his mother's intelligence. Grace inherited her mother's healing gifts and began learning medical skills as soon as she was old enough. Sam was quieter than his siblings, thoughtful and artistic, always drawing or reading. In 1896, Marlowe found herself pregnant again, much to her surprise. She was 34 years old, and it had been 6 years since Sam's birth. But the pregnancy progressed smoothly, and in early 1897 she gave birth to twin girls they named Hope and Faith. Oliver joked that they had run out of subtle names and just gone straight for the obvious, but the names suited the little girls perfectly. Life at the Quinn Ranch was full and rich. The main house was always filled with noise and activity, children running through the rooms, cousins playing together, family meals around the big table Thomas had built when they first arrived in Texas. Oliver and Marlowe often found themselves exhausted at the end of the day, falling into bed barely able to move, but they would not have changed a thing. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1894, Oliver took Marlowe back to the lake where they had met. It was spring and wildflowers covered the banks. The water sparkled in the sunlight, peaceful and inviting, with no sign of the frozen death trap it had been a decade earlier. "I wanted to bring you here," Oliver said, holding Marlowe's hand as they stood at the water's edge. "To remember, but also to see it differently. This place almost took you from me, but in a way it also gave you to me. I want you to see it now as a place of life, not death." Marlowe squeezed his hand, tears in her eyes. "You always know exactly what I need," she said softly. "I have not been back here since that day. I was afraid to. But you are right. This place brought us together. That is worth remembering." They spread a blanket on the bank and spent the afternoon there, talking and laughing and remembering their journey together. They spoke of their children and their plans for the future, of the ranch and Marlowe's medical practice, of all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that had filled their years together. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the water, Oliver pulled a small box from his pocket. Inside was a delicate gold locket, engraved with the date they had met and the date they had married. "I know we did not have much money for fancy things when we got married," Oliver said, fastening the locket around Marlowe's neck. "But I have been saving for years to get you something that would show you how much you mean to me. Inside, there is a picture of all of us, our whole family. I wanted you to carry us with you always, the same way you are always in my heart." Marlowe opened the locket to see a tiny photograph of their family, professionally taken in town just a month before. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at it, at the faces of the people she loved most in the world, at the evidence of the beautiful life they had built together. "I love you so much," she whispered, pulling Oliver close. "Thank you for never giving up on me, for saving me in every way possible." "You saved me too," Oliver reminded her. "We saved each other. That is what love does." They rode home as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, their hearts full of gratitude for the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. Neither of them could have known, that terrible winter day in 1884, that tragedy would lead to such happiness. But they knew now, and they cherished it. The turn of the century brought changes to Desdemona and to Texas as a whole. The frontier was slowly disappearing, replaced by more established communities and modern conveniences. The railroad had reached nearby towns, making travel and trade easier. Electricity came to Desdemona in 1901, though the Quinn Ranch would not be connected for several more years. Thomas Jr., now a young man of 15, showed every sign of being ready to take over the ranch when the time came. Grace, at 13, was already assisting her mother with medical cases, displaying a natural talent that surpassed even Marlowe's. Sam, at 11, had discovered a gift for writing and talked about becoming a journalist someday. The twins, Hope and Faith, were 4 years old and utterly inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and getting into mischief together. Catherine Quinn passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1903, at the age of 71. The family grieved deeply, but they also celebrated a life that had been full of love and purpose. Catherine had lived to see her grandchildren grow, and to know that the legacy she and Thomas had built would continue. Isaac and Emma Quinn still ran their portion of the ranch, and the two branches of the family worked together in harmony. Isaac's children were close in age to Oliver and Marlowe's, and the cousins were as close as siblings. Family gatherings were loud and chaotic, full of love and laughter. Oliver and Marlowe aged gracefully into middle age, their love deepening with each passing year. Oliver's dark hair gained streaks of gray at the temples, making him look distinguished. Marlowe's beauty matured into something even more striking, her eyes still as bright and intelligent as ever. They moved through life as partners in every sense of the word, supporting each other's dreams and facing challenges together. In 1905, Grace announced that she wanted to attend medical school. It was a bold dream, as female doctors were still rare and faced significant prejudice, but Marlowe and Oliver supported her completely. They used their savings to send her to the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, one of the few institutions that would train female physicians. It was hard to see her go, but they were bursting with pride at her determination. Thomas Jr. courted and married a local girl named Hannah Sinclair in 1906, and they built a house on the ranch property. The circle of family continued to expand, and in 1907, Thomas and Hannah made Oliver and Marlowe grandparents with the birth of a son they named Oliver Thomas Quinn. Holding his tiny grandson for the first time, Oliver felt the years fall away, remembering when he had first held his own son, and before that, the moment he had pulled Marlowe from beneath the ice and known somehow that his life would never be the same. Sam left for college in 1908, heading east to study journalism as he had dreamed. The house felt emptier with 2 of their 5 children gone, but Oliver and Marlowe still had the twins at home, now 11 years old, and already showing signs of the intelligent, capable women they would become. In the spring of 1909, 25 years after they had met, Oliver surprised Marlowe with a trip. He had been planning it for months, arranging with Thomas Jr. to manage the ranch in their absence. They traveled by train to San Antonio, staying in a fine hotel and spending a week exploring the city like young lovers. It was the first time they had been truly alone together since before the children were born, and it felt like a revelation. They walked along the river, ate in restaurants, visited the Alamo, and spent long evenings talking on the balcony of their hotel room. Without the constant demands of the ranch and family, they rediscovered each other in new ways, remembering who they had been as individuals before they became parents and pillars of their community. "You have any regrets?" Marlowe asked one evening as they watched the sun set over the city. "About how our lives turned out?" Oliver considered the question seriously, as he always did when Marlowe asked him something important. "No," he finally said. "Not one. There are things I wish had been different, sure. I wish my parents had lived longer. I wish the world made things easier for you and for Grace in your medical work. But regrets? No. Every choice I made led me to you and to the life we built together. How could I regret that?" "I feel the same," Marlowe said softly. She leaned against him, comfortable and content. "Sometimes I think about that girl who walked out onto the ice, so lost in her grief that she did not care if she lived or died. She seems like a stranger to me now. I can barely remember being that unhappy." "You have always been strong," Oliver said, kissing the top of her head. "Even at your lowest point you fought to survive. That is what I saw when I looked through that ice, Marlowe. I saw a fighter. I saw someone worth saving." "We saved each other." Marlowe repeated the words Oliver had said years before. "That is what love does." They returned to the ranch renewed and refreshed, ready to face whatever the future held. And the future, as it turned out, held more joy than they could have imagined. Grace graduated from medical school in 1911, one of a small but growing number of female physicians in the country. She returned to Texas and opened an official medical practice in Desdemona, working alongside her mother. Together, they provided medical care to the entire region, training more young women and slowly but surely changing attitudes about what women could and should be allowed to do. Sam became a successful journalist, writing for newspapers in Dallas, and eventually publishing a book about life on the Texas frontier. In his writing, he always spoke with pride about his parents, about his father the cowboy who had built a successful ranch through hard work and integrity, and his mother the healer who had saved countless lives, despite never having a medical degree. Thomas Jr. and Hannah had 3 more children, filling the ranch with another generation of Quinns. The twins, Hope and Faith, both became teachers, opening a small school on the ranch property where they taught not just the Quinn children but children from surrounding farms and ranches. As Oliver and Marlowe moved into their 50s and then their 60s, they gradually stepped back from the daily demands of work. Thomas Jr. took over full management of the ranch, running it with the same dedication his father and grandfather had shown. Grace and her husband, a fellow doctor she had met in medical school, managed the medical practice. The family legacy was secure. Oliver and Marlowe spent their later years as they had spent their younger ones together. They took long rides across the land they loved, visited their children and growing number of grandchildren, and sat together on their porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the Texas hills. They had been blessed with good health and long lives, and they treasured every moment. On a cold winter day in 1924, exactly 40 years after they had met, Oliver and Marlowe returned once more to the lake. They were both 62 years old now, their hair gray, their faces lined with age and laughter. But when they looked at each other, they saw the same people they had been all those years ago, young and in love and full of hope. The lake was frozen again, though not as solidly as it had been in that unusual winter of 1884. They stood at the edge, holding hands, remembering. 40 years, Marlowe said wonderingly. Can you believe it has been 40 years? Some days it feels like a lifetime, Oliver said with a smile. Other days it feels like just yesterday that I saw you through that ice, fighting to survive. Do you know what I thought about down there under the water? Marlowe asked. She had never told him this before. I thought about my father. I thought about how disappointed he would be that I had given up. And then I saw your face through the ice, saw you fighting to reach me, and I knew I had to keep trying. I had to fight, because someone was fighting for me. Oliver pulled her close, holding her as carefully as he had that first day when she had been so cold and fragile in his arms. And you have been fighting ever since, he said proudly. Fighting for your patients, for our children's futures, for what you believe in. You are the strongest person I have ever known, Marlowe Quinn. I learned it from you, Marlowe said. You taught me that life is worth fighting for, that love is worth risking everything for. You gave me back my life, Oliver. And then you made that life so beautiful that I cannot imagine having lived it any other way. They stayed at the lake until the sun began to set, talking about their children and grandchildren, about the ranch and the medical practice, about all the threads of their lives that had woven together into something so much bigger than either of them had dreamed possible. They talked about the future, about the grandchildren who were just starting their own families, about the legacy they would leave behind. As they prepared to leave, Marlowe took one last look at the lake, at the place where she had nearly died and instead found her entire life's purpose. The water was still and peaceful, reflecting the winter sky. It held no terror for her anymore, only gratitude. Oliver and Marlowe lived on into their 70s, a remarkable age for their generation. They remained active and engaged, beloved by their family and respected by their community. The Quinn Ranch continued to prosper under Thomas Jr.'s management, and Grace's medical practice became one of the most respected in the region. Their other children thrived in their chosen paths, and their grandchildren grew up strong and healthy. In the spring of 1931, Marlowe fell ill with pneumonia. Despite Grace's best efforts and all of modern medicine's advances, the illness was severe. Marlowe was 69 years old, and her body could not fight as it once had. Oliver stayed by her side every moment, holding her hand, talking to her, reminding her of all they had shared. I am not afraid, Marlowe told him one evening as the family gathered around her bed. "I have lived such a good life, Oliver, so much longer and fuller than I ever imagined possible. I am not afraid to rest now." "I know," Oliver said, tears streaming down his weathered face, "but I am not ready to let you go. I have never been ready to let you go, not from the moment I saw you under that ice." "You will never have to let me go," Marlowe assured him. "I will always be with you. In our children, in our grandchildren, in the life we built together. That never goes away, Oliver. Love does not end." She died peacefully that night, surrounded by her family with Oliver's hand in hers. The town of Desdemona mourned the loss of one of its most beloved citizens, and people came from all over the region to attend her funeral. They spoke of the lives she had saved, the kindness she had shown, the barriers she had broken down. But for Oliver and his children, they simply mourned the woman they had loved, the center of their family, the heart of their home. Oliver lived for 3 more years after Marlowe's death. They were quiet years, filled with memories and grandchildren. He spent his days on the ranch he had built, watching the cattle graze and the horses run, remembering all the dreams he and Marlowe had shared. Thomas Jr. and his family took care of him, making sure he was never alone, that he always had someone to talk to. But everyone could see that part of Oliver had died with Marlowe. They had been together for 47 years, longer than most people lived at all. They had built a life and a legacy that would last for generations. But more than that, they had loved each other with a depth and devotion that was rare in any era. On a cold winter morning in early 1934, Oliver Quinn passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72. The family laid him to rest beside Marlowe in the cemetery outside Desdemona, under a tree they had planted together years before. The headstone reads simply, "Oliver Quinn and Marlowe Quinn, together forever." Their children stood at the graveside, grieving but also grateful. They knew how lucky they had been to have parents who loved each other so completely, who had built such a strong foundation for their family. They told their own children stories about Oliver and Marlowe, about the day they met when Oliver saved Marlowe from beneath the ice, about how that moment had changed not just their lives, but the lives of everyone they touched. The Quinn Ranch continued for generations, each one building on what Oliver and Thomas had started. Grace's medical practice evolved into a clinic that still serves the region, carrying on Marlowe's legacy of healing. Sam's writings preserved the history of their family and of the Texas frontier. The twins' school grew into a proper institution, educating hundreds of children over the years. But more than any of these accomplishments, Oliver and Marlowe's true legacy was the love they had shared and passed on to their children and grandchildren. They had shown that even in the harsh environment of the frontier, even facing prejudice and hardship, love could thrive and grow and create something beautiful that would last long after they were gone. The lake where they met eventually dried up, a victim of changing weather patterns and increasing development. But the Quinn family never forgot what that place represented. They told the story to each new generation, about how their great-great-grandparents had met in the most dramatic way possible, about how tragedy had led to joy, about how one moment of courage and compassion had rippled forward through time, creating a family and a legacy that would last forever. And if you visit the Quinn Ranch today, now run by Oliver and Marlowe's great-great-grandchildren, you will find a marker on the spot where that lake once stood. It is a simple stone monument, engraved with words that Oliver wrote in his journal many years after that fateful day, words that Marlowe read and insisted should be their epitaph. "She was drowning and I pulled her out. She was lost and I helped her find her way. But the truth is, she saved me just as much as I saved her. That is what love does. It saves us. The story of Oliver and Marlowe Quinn became legend in Desdemona, Texas, a tale passed down through generations. It reminded people that heroism can come in unexpected moments, that love can bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, and that sometimes the worst days of our lives can lead us to the best ones. Their great-great-grandchildren still live on the land Oliver and his father claimed all those years ago, still run cattle under the big Texas sky, still tell stories of the cowboy who saved a woman from beneath the ice and ended up saving himself in the process. The medical clinic that grew from Marlowe's kitchen table practice still serves the community, now fully accepting of female doctors and carrying on her tradition of compassionate care. The house Oliver built for Marlowe still stands, carefully maintained by the family, a museum of sorts filled with photographs and mementos. There are pictures of them at every age, young and beautiful and full of life, older and graying but still holding hands, always together. There are Marlowe's medical instruments, Oliver's branding irons and spurs, books they read and quilts they slept under. It is a monument to an ordinary life made extraordinary by love. On winter evenings, when the wind blows cold across the Texas plains, people say you can still feel their presence there, in the house and on the land they loved so much. It is not a ghostly presence, nothing frightening or sad. It is simply the echo of a love so strong that it left its imprint on the world, a reminder that we are all shaped by the people who choose to save us, in whatever way we need saving. Oliver and Marlowe Quinn lived and loved and built something that mattered. They raised children who made the world better, who passed on their values of courage and compassion and hard work. They showed everyone who knew them that true love is not just a feeling but a choice, made every day, to stand by someone through joy and sorrow, triumph and tragedy, youth and age. Their story began with ice and drowning and desperate fear. It continued through years of laughter and tears, hard work and deep satisfaction, raising children and building a life. And it ended, as all stories must, with death and grief and the passage of time. But the love they shared did not end. It lives on in their descendants, in the institutions they built, in the land they stewarded, in the lives they touched and saved. That is the true legacy of Oliver and Marlowe Quinn, the cowboy and the doctor's daughter who found each other on the worst day of her life and made every day after worth living. They proved that love is stronger than death, that courage matters, that compassion heals, and that sometimes, if we are very lucky, the person we save ends up saving us right back. And in Desdemona, Texas, on cold winter nights when the stars shine bright and clear, people still tell their children the story of the woman trapped under ice and the cowboy who broke through to save her, not knowing that in doing so he was saving them both.